I'm trying to be as transparent as possible without losing the integrity of the investigation. As much as I want to give all the information that we have, at the same time, though, we have to understand that when the information is put out there and it either going to help us, that suspect, person of interest, may get that information, because let's face it, they do watch the news because they have to be ahead of what we're doing. It gives them an opportunity to leave this area.
Well, that's Seattle's interim police chief, Andre Sales, speaking at a public safety committee meeting this week in front of the Seattle City Council as the SPD tries to sort out a series of concerns, including security at major events like the Bite of Seattle following the deadly shooting there, communication issues following a 5-hour delay in getting out information about that shooting, and much more. Plus, what's next in the search for a permanent chief? The city council did not support the mayor's decision to ask for Shon Barnes' resignation, and now the council wants to play a much stronger role in the process to select a new chief. I'm going to keep the focus on the SPD and public safety this week on Seattle News Views and Brews, your coffee break political podcast. But I've got to look at the primaries and a new and very different RV homelessness proposal on the docket, too. Brian Callanan here with you. I'm a host on the Seattle channel. The views expressed here are mine. And I'm with a special guest this week, Erica C. Barnett, co-founder and editor of Publicola. Erica, thank you so much for making time for the show.
Thanks for having me.
And thanks also to our background noise sponsor, City Grind Espresso on the first floor of City Hall. John, thanks for looking out, buddy. You can become a patron of the show on Patreon. Giving levels start at just $5 a month. You get access to Patrons First podcast. You even get a snazzy-looking decal, too. So please head to Patreon, become a paying member. Thanks also to Converge Media. The video version of the program is on Converge most Wednesday nights at 7 o'clock. Let's get her going here. Time for Right Here, Right Now. Erica, I wanted to bring you on the show because you've been doing a lot of research and reporting on the resignation of Chief Barnes, a resignation requested by Mayor Wilson following the deadly Bite of Seattle shooting on July 26th. You broke the story on how often he's been out of town during his time as chief, which has set you up for a lot of criticism. I know I heard some of that on my podcast last week with Omari. I want to recognize that. I want to recognize you have plenty of supporters, too. If you want to touch on that side of things, please do. But as best I can, I'd love to move away from the social media outrage machine and talk about the facts you've been reporting on with Chief Barnes and his travel schedule especially.
Yeah, I have been reporting actually since last year on the amount that former Chief Barnes has been out of town. And I think that some of the criticism has come from the fact that he does go to a lot of conferences. Some of the criticism of my reporting, that is, he goes to a lot of conferences. Other police chiefs have also gone to conferences. These are law enforcement related conferences, networking conferences, that sort of thing.
They can help with recruiting and stuff like that. Yeah, keep going.
Yeah, and typically it's a lot of, leadership type stuff. I personally kind of think that police chiefs should be in town more anyway, and not so much going around to all these conferences in places like Las Vegas and, Washington, D.C., other places in the United States. But that aside, the thing that is different about Chief Barnes, number one, my reporting has shown that he's out of town between last year. I looked at a small amount of his schedule that I was able to get, and it was more than a quarter of the time. This year, it was 40% of the time. And so that means that almost half the time, I think it was actually like 38.9%. So something around there, but almost 40% of the time he was out of town. A large percentage of that was time spent in Chicago, where his family lives. He owns a house there with his family. He rents an apartment here, or, was renting an apartment here at least. And that is unusual. The fact that he maintains a family home outside the state of Washington means that, he just wasn't here a lot of the time that a chief would ordinarily be, at least in the region. And so if critics are saying that being out of town 40% of the time is normal for a police chief, A, they're wrong. That's not correct. It is not normal, and previous chiefs were not out of town that much. B, I think we really have to ask a question about, if we're going to pay somebody $370,000 plus to be the police chief of Seattle and they're out of town that much of the time, are they really the police chief of Seattle? Or are they sort of going around to conferences, networking, building up support for the next job that they're going to go on to, and not even setting down any sort of real roots here? I think that, just speaking for myself, those things are concerning. Yeah. And I would hope that, if it was the mayor of Seattle, we do require them to live in Seattle. And any other department head, you don't have that kind of leeway for them to live out of town that much, or just to be out of town that much.
Yeah, that requirement to live here, that's a really interesting piece of this. And it was not legally required for Barnes to have a permanent residence here with his family, et cetera. And I guess what I'm trying to look at here is how this is different from other chiefs in the past. And you and I have talked about this. There have been other chiefs that have not grown up within the ranks of the Seattle PD, and they have moved here and they've brought families here. And I know this is a little different for Barnes, but I wanted to talk about that too, because there have been other chiefs in the past who have been from out of town. We haven't had a ton of homegrown police chiefs over the past several years here. We've had a pretty even mix, I think, between the people who've been homegrown and then the people who are coming in from out of town, or maybe a few more of the out of towners, I guess.
Yeah, I mean, if you look back at sort of our more longstanding permanent police chiefs, I'm leaving aside kind of all the temporary folks that have stepped in, like Surar. Gil Kurlikowski was from out of town. I mean, that's going back to kind of the limits of my time here 25 years ago. Norm Stamper was from out of town. Chief Kathleen O'Toole was from out of town. So, I mean, I would say if anything, we kind of swing back and forth. We have a chief, they go away, maybe we're mad at them, and then we get somebody from in town, and then, it's kind of a pendulum swing. And I expect, that'll probably be, a similar debate with this next chief.
I would imagine so. And I guess I just wanted to make sure I tried to give Chief Barnes some credit where it's due. You've certainly heard the argument that crime stats have been down with Chief Barnes at the helm, including this month of June where there were no homicides in Seattle. Should Chief Barnes get some credit for that? What do you think?
I think who the police chief is has very little to do with whether, with the anomaly of a calendar month with no homicides. I mean, then we saw homicides, obviously, in July. There is a national trend of less violence and less, just less crime in general, but particularly violent crime. And I think that's a good thing. I don't think that you can then go and credit every single police chief in every city where crime has dropped with that crime drop. I think it's post-COVID, reduction in crime, and that's a good thing. But okay. I would not credit the chief directly with that.
You do hear from a lot of council members that did have a good relationship with him, and certainly we've seen some of the fallout with that, with their kind of back and forth with the mayor. But just looking at that part of it, having a chief who has a good relationship with the city council, that's important. I mean, if he came in a combative way and was not working with the council, I think that would be an issue. And he didn't do that. Again, he came across in a very professorial kind of way, I think, a lot of times when I was talking to him. I felt that it felt like he had a good relationship with the council. And I think that's worth something. I just wanted to make sure I threw that at you.
Yeah, I mean, I agree. Again, I'm sorry to be such a negative Nelly or whatever.
No.
But I think that this particular council, I mean, he had a good relationship with the people on the council that are aligned with him politically. That's a majority of the council. And I think he had, perhaps a less good relationship with those who are not. I mean, being affable in public is one thing, but I do think, and I know you've discussed sort of why did he get fired. I do think that when he sort of lashed out at reporter Connor Nash, from what I heard in my reporting,
and Connor was asking about some of the things you brought up in your reporting with regard to how often he's out of town. Keep going.
Right, and I will say, like, Chief Barnes was always never sat down for an interview with me. And generally, when I would ask him questions at press conferences, it was a tense interaction, to say the least. But when he lashed out at this reporter and sort of, had to be escorted away by his chief of staff, when people behave like that in general, and when it happens in public, that is a manifestation of, the way that they behave. I don't think that people do that once. From what I've heard, that was an example of sort of his behind the scenes behavior happening in public and very much in the cameras, in the camera's eye with lots of reporters around.
Yeah.
So, I mean, professorial affability, I mean, that's a way of acting, but he also acted other ways as well. So People are complicated. But but to me, that alone, for a department head to do that, like, that is a potential firing offense in itself.
Yeah, that shouting back and forth. Yeah,
with the reporter. And so, I mean, he certainly said stuff about me also in public on the council dais. So I think you have to consider both of those types of behaviors when you're judging, sort of the way a person behaves.
Got it. And I do want to try to separate this from being the personal back and forth that I know it has become for you, and I appreciate what you're going through there. I also wanted to make sure I brought up some of the other pieces you've reported on with regard to, and this one has been important to me in watching it over the past year plus, how Chief Barnes has worked with CARE, or maybe not worked with CARE, Community Assisted Response and Engagement. This was something that's very important to the council, but it's been very difficult for the council to really enact CARE to the full extent that they'd like to, because there's a police officers guild contract in place that really limits the amount of time that care teams can actually be used out in the field. These are the 911 alternative folks out there. I think in looking at this, were you thinking that Barnes could somehow have a better way of guiding care into the mix, or convincing the rank and file police officers that care was a good idea? Help me out with that part of it.
Yeah, I mean, certainly a police chief could do that. Could, for example, order sergeants to direct more calls to care. I mean, I think Amy Barden, the director of the care team and of care department, has said this contract is pretty binding, and I wrote about it at the time. It restricts where the care team can go and what kind of calls they can respond to, and literally physically where they're allowed to be. But I mean, she says she believes there's some leeway that the police department is not taking. And, notably, I mean, for the first year or so that Barnes was police chief, Amy Barden said that he did not meet with her once.
I heard that
and,
too. Yeah.
I think that is something that, I mean, the police chief should probably be meeting with the care team. They're, theoretically co-equal chiefs of departments.
Right.
And when you're not doing that, I mean, there is just no leeway, or there's no way for the care team. There's no leverage for them to say, we'd like to be responding to the kind of calls we were created to respond to, which is mental health crisis calls that don't require a cop.
Right.
And they have not been able to do that. So I think the hope is that perhaps interim chief sales will be more responsive. And he told me last week that he has already met with Amy Barden a couple of times.
That's a good sign, I guess, on that front. I know it's a big deal for the council. I brought that up before because they're pouring more money into care. They wanted this to be a citywide response here, and trying to coordinate that with the police is going to take a lot of work ahead for sure. I did want to talk about the chief's resignation, Chief Barnes' resignation, and how it impacts this relationship between Mayor Wilson and the city council. You have some council members who have called her incompetent. Many have said they don't have confidence in her leadership after the resignation of the chief. And I got to say, the mayor has not been great at communicating with the council in her first 6 or 7 months in office. She pushed out legislation like her homelessness shelter plan without a lot of collaboration with the council. That's one example there. There's been plenty of shakeup in the staff for the mayor's office, too. But I wanted to talk about this relationship, how it is between the mayor and council right now, and how that affects the leadership of the city moving forward.
I think that the mayor is, from what I understand, trying to improve that relationship. I mean, I do think a lot of it is on her because, I mean, the examples you mentioned, those are things that, originated from the mayor's office. I think she had staff that were rude to the council,
yes,
at least the council perceived them as being that way. And, and didn't involve the council in legislation. And, I mean, you got to have the council involved. I mean, her shelter legislation, she didn't even get a sponsor initially, which is like a normal part of the process. So I think there's a lot of room for improvement there. I think the mayor's office is aware of the need for that, but, I don't know that they have repaired that relationship. And I do think this decision with Barnes, I mean, I think the outsized reaction is in part because that relationship isn't there. I mean, I don't think you would have Deborah Juarez going on Como and telling Chris Daniels that, Katie Wilson is incompetent. Well, you might have Deborah Juarez doing that, but I don't think that the reaction would be quite as outsized as it has been if they did have that better relationship already existing.
That makes sense. What about this process of finding a new police chief? Because the council has said, I've heard a number of different people, including Council President Hollingsworth, say, we want to be involved. We want to be involved in this decision. That's not typically how a search for a chief works. I'm just trying to figure out what's next.
Yeah, I mean, it's not. And the last chief, I mean, Barnes was selected by Bruce Harrell with basically no public process whatsoever. And so I think that what I have heard from the mayor's office is that they want to do, what they always say, transparent, open process. I have also heard that their plan is to, I don't know how long this is going to take, but that their plan is to do a different type of process than usual. Usually they bring in a consulting firm. It's like former Chief O'Toole or former interim chief Sue Rahr. Yeah. And they go through that sort of process. And you tend to get kind of the same type of police chiefs who are all kind of in the same, like I mentioned, these conference circles, right?
Sure. Right.
The mayor's office says they're not doing that, but I don't know how much they're planning to involve the council. Hopefully quite a lot, because she does need the council's approval to actually, create a permanent chief. And I mean, TBD, but she's promising a lot of transparency. We'll see what actually happens.
We will see, and then we'll see who actually wants this job. There's been so much churn in the Seattle police chief position over the past several years here. So interested to see what happens next. I do want to talk about something else with you up next, Erica. More on public safety and the city council as Councilmember Dan Strauss is putting forth a proposal to deal with people who are homeless living in RVs. It's a plan that would create a very different approach for the city. More next on Now Hear This. In the Public Safety Committee meeting this week, Councilmember Dan Strauss is sponsoring a proposal for what he calls a Vehicle Resident Assistance Program. This is to help people who are homeless, living in RVs and other vehicles. 1 out of every 4 people who are unsheltered in our region lives in a vehicle. That's data from the 2024 point-in-time count, as quoted by the council member. But Strauss points out that there are 0 shelters set up for people living in vehicles, no safe parking slots open, and the city is outsourcing its response to this problem.
We rely on contracted outreach for the majority of our services. 2/3 of those contracts are run by an organization that is fiscally sponsored by another one. I just say all of this because it is a gaping hole in how we address homelessness to not be able to provide the services to people who have very unique needs compared to couch surfing, compared to youth homelessness, compared to street homelessness.
Erica, thank you for flagging the story to me this week. And I want to break down this proposal from Strauss because it seems like it would represent a very different approach from the city. It would restrict parking for RVs to 2 hours maximum in all areas of the city. It would prohibit parking between midnight and 6 a.m. for RVs and set up a permit program for RVs to park in industrial zones during those hours. And this big one for me, once you get that permit, the permit would be revoked if a permit holder turns down offers of appropriate shelter 6 times. Help me unpack this one. Where do you want to start?
Well, let's start actually with what Strauss said about there being no shelter for people living in RVs, because I do want to mention, there is, you described some of the sort of stick elements of the proposal, and I want to talk about those, but just quickly, the rest of the proposal would provide or would pay for some combination of shelter, probably like a tiny house village with RVs on site. The idea is to have 2 of those. The city is about to open one. About to in November at the Glass Yard. It's going to be called the Glass Yard Commons at a lot in West Seattle. It would pay for that. It would also expand the unified care team by another 7 people. That's the group that goes around and does outreach to encampments, but also sweeps encampments.
Yep.
So that's sort of the side of, let's give people in RVs a place to live.
Thank you.
The stick side, as you described, I mean, it's pretty harsh. It says you basically cannot park overnight in Seattle. Right now, RVs are allowed in industrial land, but this includes industrial land unless you get one of these permits. And there's all kind of ways you can have a permit revoked besides, refusing appropriate quote unquote shelter, which is not defined in the legislation in any way.
I am really concerned about that phrase in terms of how this goes forward legally. Keep going.
Yeah. Well, let's go there. I mean, the appropriate, is a term. It's not a term of art. It doesn't mean anything. And so when you say appropriate shelter, if it's appropriate, then the person will take it. So if the person does not take it, it is inappropriate in my mind. So, I think that there are different types of shelter. There's tiny house villages, there's shelter beds, there's other alternatives. I mean, Dan Strauss mentioned to me that they could get a smaller vehicle and live in their car.
Okay.
So, I mean, who determines what's appropriate? And then when you yank that permit, I mean, what happens is the person either has to leave Seattle or they will get their vehicle impounded and then they will be on the street. Not a great outcome if the problem is that they're not being offered shelter that, or housing that works for them.
Do you feel it going down the path of criminalizing homelessness? Because I'm trying to imagine what happens. Oops, you turned down shelter for the 6th time. You're busted. I mean, what happens then? What does that look like?
Well, it's not criminalizing in the sense that, I mean, people aren't going to be arrested. It's not going to be illegal to be homeless. But
they'll take their vehicles, it sounds like.
They'll take their vehicles, yeah. And I think that, I mean, Strauss was pretty explicit about this. The goal is to not have any RVs parked on city streets at all within, a year or so of this this thing going into effect. That would be a big change. And it hasn't worked in other cities. San Francisco, it's a very similar plan failed because, I mean, there's just not enough shelter. And that's the same problem that we run up against with all kinds of homeless. And so I think that it's pretty unlikely that, in 2 years from now, we're going to see absolutely no RVs on the streets, which is the plan. If we do, I think it will be the result of some pretty harsh policies towards the people living in those RVs.
I hear what you're saying. I mean, it's not I always wrestle with this with homelessness. I think everybody would like to see no RVs on the streets in 2 years from now. I don't think anyone would disagree with that. But yeah, you're right. The way you do it is going to be really, really highly scrutinized here. And I wonder what's the feedback? Have you done some of the research there in terms of different outreach groups that work with homeless people, what they're saying about this?
Well, I am, as we're recording this on Tuesday, I'm still doing reporting on that. What I've heard is that Strauss has worked with one particular vehicle residency group, the University Heights Center, and that there wasn't a lot of outreach until late last week and early this week about this proposal to other groups and to homeless advocates. And I think there's a lot of concerns that are coming up, like the ones I just mentioned. And so I think there will be a lot of pressure to kind of slow this down and look at some of because it's 6 pieces of legislation and they're all complex. I think there'll be some pressure to slow down and talk about this and make some amendments at the very least.
Yeah, it's such an interesting time to bring this up because next week, folks, we've got a city council that's going on their summer break for a couple of weeks. And then when they come back, it always feels like to me, Erica, kind of a pell-mell race towards November when everyone's working through the budget. And so, yeah, I'm interested to see how this works along with that process over the next couple of weeks here. But clearly, Dan Strauss has a plan in mind, and we'll see what happens in these meetings upcoming. All right, well, coming up, a look back at the results of the August primary, what that means to Seattle voters. That's just ahead on What's Next. Erica, let's talk primary elections. Happened back in the early part of August here. Progressive voters showed up in District 5 for that city council race. A win for Nilu Jenks there. What did her 54% up against 33% for Julie Kang in second place? They're both going to the general here. What did those numbers say to you? Did that result from Jenks surprise you?
It actually did. I did not expect to see such a huge gap between these two candidates. I think Julie Kang is the more sort of centrist, moderate coded candidate in this race. And Nilu Jenks ran before as a progressive, did not make it through the primary in the race that elected Kathy Moore, probably a city council member who you could, reasonably call pretty conservative for Seattle. She stepped aside, resigned, didn't like the job. Deborah Juarez is now in that seat.
Right.
So, so I think that swing from Nilu Jenks, getting in the teens to getting above 50% really says something about not just District 5, which, is one of the more conservative districts in Seattle, but also just kind of how we can predict the next elections going as well. We had kind of what I would call backlash election to the sort of Black Lives Matter 2020, COVID restrictions, et cetera, in 2023.
Yeah.
And I think in 2027, if I am one of the district candidates that's coming up for re-election that was elected in 2023, I'd be a little worried.
Yeah, no, it's interesting. I guess I was also interested to see, though, that Mayor Wilson's first attempt at endorsing candidates came up short. There were some progressive candidates that did not do as well looking for state positions. I'm thinking about Hannah Sabio Powell. Wilson was pushing for her to take Jamie Peterson's Senate seat in the 43rd District. Sabio Powell will go through to the general. Her 18% of the vote is up against Peterson's 71%. That doesn't look promising there. Then you got Wilson's pick of Ron Davis to take Representative Jerry Pollitt's seat in the 46th, falling completely flat. Davis finishing third in the primary. He's out. What do you make of those races?
Well, yeah, I mean, I think that in both cases, and particularly in Jamie Peterson's case, you have pretty entrenched incumbents with a lot of seniority, meaning, a fair amount of power, particularly in Jamie's case, and I think that, these candidates did not make a particularly compelling case against their opponents. Again, particularly with Jamie Peterson, because
that was a tough one for me. How are you? Keep going. Yeah.
So Hannah Savio Howell was sort of trying to portray him as insufficiently progressive, and I think she struggled with that because he was responsible for sort of shepherding the
The
so-called
millionaire's
millionaires
tax.
tax
Yeah,
through.
right.
Yeah, and and that's, I mean, it's an income tax on income above $1 million. I think that, I mean, it's so in the clouds. It should be non-controversial, but of course it's not. It's going to be up for referendum in
Yes.
November. But, I mean, he's kind of a progressive hero in a lot of ways. And so, yeah, I mean, it's just very hard to make the argument that he is, somehow a conservative or too centrist or ineffective.
Yeah.
And again, and he has a ton of seniority and
Yeah.
is, you elect somebody else into that seat, even if they are a candidate more in line with the district, which I don't think, I don't think was the case here. But even if you do, I mean, they have no seniority. They have to start at the very beginning. And so that was a big risk.
Yeah, I think it was too. And Jerry Pollitt, I know, was saying, wait a minute, I've been talking about City of Seattle priorities all the time in my work, and so that was interesting to see that gambit by Wilson there for sure. Then I just wanted to just touch on the fact political newcomer Kalabe Tewolde actually finished ahead of a longtime state representative Sharon Tomiko Santos in the 37th legislative district. Those two will go on to the general, but interested to see how that one goes because Tewolde got about 51% of the vote compared to 48% for Santos there. Just to wrap up with you, Erica, I always like to know what is in your mind looking ahead to the fall, thinking about elections, etc. Is there a political race you're really keyed in on, or another political story, I guess, that you're really focused in on as we look ahead to the fall?
Well, I mean, political race, I would say, just to repeat, I mean, that Nilo Jinks race
That'll be
versus Julie
interesting.
Kang, I'm going to be paying close attention to that. And then, in the fall, I think that what is going to dominate is, as you mentioned, the budget. There's a, perhaps $200 million deficit that the city is going to have to close. And I think there's going to be a lot of pressure to, as always, to not cut the police or to expand the police budget. And
Right.
I think that that's going to be a real flashpoint between Katie Wilson and the council, because I think Wilson is going to try to at least keep the budget stable. She's asked the police for, I think a $20 million potential cut. I don't think that's likely to happen, but I think that's going to be a big battle in the fall, unless Katie Wilson just sort of concedes in advance. But I don't think that's going to happen. So I think the budget's going to be a huge issue this year.
Yeah, always is, especially this year with that big deficit we're talking about. A big thank you to Erica C. Barnett, co-founder and publisher of Publicola, also co-host of the Seattle Nice podcast. Erica, I really appreciate you being on the show.
Oh, thank you, Brian.
And meanwhile, thanks to everybody who's listening to Seattle News, Views, and Brews, where you can always find out what's brewing in local politics. Become a patron, please. Check out Seattle News, Views, and Brews on Patreon. Pledge $5 a month or more. Thank you for the help. Great to have you listening to this podcast on Apple, Overcast, Spotify, wherever you are tuning in. Thanks for watching on Converge Media, too. See you next time. Seattle News, Views, and Brews is an independent production of Callanan Media Services. Copyright 2026.